Today's video is brought to you by the generosity of Newbold targets. Newbold targets are self-sealing reactive polymer targets that act like steel targets for training and practice, but are safer than steel. They allow bullets to pass completely through the target without ricochet or lead splatter. Check out their links in the description and thank them for bringing us today's video.
But that'll cost more money.
Well, if they had been trained to use their tasers effectively instead of doing what they did, I'll tell you, one of the banes of my existence is the over-reliance on the magic electric pistol in police work. They go straight to the taser. It's supposed to solve all their problems. How often have you seen on video taser failures? I know you look at stuff
50% or more.
I'm fairly well trained. I've been to multiple instructor courses, physical control tactics, etc. For me, the taser's been 50-50. Mm-hmm. Clothing disconnects, barb separations from the wires, all kinds of problems. 50% of the time it works, 50% of the time it doesn't. So it's just one of those is what it is things. I'm not going to count on 50-50. I'm just not.
You just can't.
And you can't. And this is one of those cases where they were in a tangle, tried to use it, didn't use it effectively. We had yet another failure. During the course of this, unfortunately, I believe that the officer that ended up firing the shots got both of the cartridges on his taser fired, and both of those were ineffective. Neither one of those were effective on Mr. Brooks. So at that point, his choices are really diminished. I've already tried to hit him with the taser twice. That didn't work. He's got to try and reload that thing on the fly in the middle of a foot chase. And now I got something pointed at me.
So before we get there, Chuck, let's talk about the flight.
Okay.
So I know people go, well, why didn't they just let him run? They knew who he was. They could hook him up later. Why not just let him run? What are your thoughts on that?
Again, at what point do we hold people accountable for their actions? Everybody involved in this was an adult. Everybody involved in this was an adult. This guy had just committed several misdemeanors and at least 2 felonies.
Yeah, I saw 4 at that point.
Several misdemeanors and at least 2 felonies. He's got a weapon in his hand. What is he going to do next? Do I have to, oh, well, he's going to play nice if I let him go, and he won't carjack somebody to get him to escape the area. I'm going to count on that. I'm going to count on him not carjacking somebody to further his flight from the area. That's the kind of thing you want me to count on. Is thus far, he's been violent. He's committed a couple of felonies. He's DUI. But all of a sudden, I'm supposed to count on his good nature as a human being. If your grandma was a block away, what would you want the cops to do?
Right. I think chasing a violent felon is not something that we want our police not to do. I mean, we go, look, if a lot of police departments, somebody's doing something misdemeanor and they skedaddle, they'll be like, all right, whatever, we'll hook him up another day, whatever. I'm not going to chase him down. But a violent felony, that's a different story. And that's, again, a policy decision. And you can't change the game up in the middle of the game. You can't change the rules. All right, so let's talk about him shooting him in the back.
There was another point I was going to make, and it'll come back to me.
It was about the taser, and he ran off, didn't get the taser barbs in him.
Well, the whole tangle, handcuffing tactics, not having a ground game, not having neck restraints, taser failure, inadequate use of the taser, all added up to ineffective uses of force up to that point. And then we have an officer who is chasing him, who's just been punched in the face, had his head bounced off the pavement, and he sees something pointed at him. He hears a pop. I can tell you on the street, when we first got tasers at my job some years ago, we started out with the M26s. I saw more than one case of people who I know had street experience on the wrong side of the law. They've been around gunfire. They've shot people. And when they saw a black object in the officer's hands and they heard a pop and a little flash, they hit the deck. one of the guys that I had kind of a professional relationship with that I could talking to him on the way to jail. And he was fighting the officer. The officer pulled the taser in the dark. Dude hears the pop, sees the flash, sees something in the cop's hands. Dude hits the deck because he thought the officer was one of those officers and was just going to pull his pistol and illegally kill him. So he hit the deck.
Wow.
Right. So a very experienced street felon thought that a taser being fired was a gun being fired. That's not uncommon. So people are going to second guess the officer. Well, he knew it was a taser. I don't know that he knew that guy had gotten away with the other officer's taser. Is it possible he pulled his own gun? Is it possible he got the other officer's gun in that scrap? You could see on the badge camera how big of a fight that was. We're all over the place. We're looking at the sky. We're looking at the ground, things like that.
Yeah.
Human perspective in a grapple is very, very similar. Vision it's hard to get a big picture. So it's not like a Jet Li movie where you get to watch all this stuff in slow motion. That's not how it works.
It's just not. And I think that expecting that out of somebody is probably unreasonable. And they hadn't searched him completely. They did a quick Terry frisk, pat down his pockets, but they didn't do a full search of him. That was going to be incident to arrest. So they hadn't fully searched him. And again, in all that scrap, we knew he had the taser. Did we know he had, what it was? And when the guy turns around and points the gun, what is he going to do? And it points the taser, but in that second, with my bell rung, he just literally had decked him right in the face super hard. Is it reasonable to expect him to be able to see all of that in a darkened environment? I don't think it is. And then, of course, there's a few people on the channel right now, Chuck, talking about, but there's no justification ever to shoot someone in the back. He's running away and he's in the back. I said as a firearms instructor, it's not about where you shoot someone, it's about why. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So I think looking at Garner versus Tennessee, which does allow in limited circumstances shooting people merely for fleeing under the right circumstances. So let's say somebody everybody knows is pretty heinous, Charles Manson. Let's say Charles Manson was escaping the scene of his latest mass murder. The police are chasing him, and let's say Charles Manson runs really fast. Now, Charles Manson has a machete in his hand and is running, and he's gaining on me while I chase him, and I see that Charles Manson is running towards a kindergarten playground. Should I shoot Charles Manson in the back? I should shoot him in the back, and I should shoot him right now before he gets to the kindergarten playground carrying a bloody machete. When I lay that scenario out, people think it's pretty silly, but it brings up the point. I've never met anybody that won't agree, yes, you should shoot Charles Manson in the back before he gets to the kindergarten playground with the bloody machete. Mm-hmm. So now what we're going to argue, yes, it can be reasonable under the circumstances. So now we're just arguing how far do those circumstances extend?
True.
And under Supreme Court doctrine handed down to the cops, Garner versus Tennessee, Graham v. Connor, are laws of deadly force. When you can and cannot use deadly force are very clearly delineated. That's a bright line rule Supreme Court has laid down. And it's a good ruling. If we go way back in Supreme Court doctrine to Brown versus U.S., Oliver Wendell Holmes gave us a brilliant line in that decision, which was a civilian, a non-cop self-defense case, where Brown shot a dude advancing on him with a knife. And he was convicted of murder because everybody's like, well, the guy just had a knife and he was 10 feet away. You shouldn't have shot him. That was unreasonable. And by the time it got to the Supreme Court said, no, that's pretty reasonable, and laid out some of the groundwork for reasonable force, reasonable man rules, self-defense law in the United States. Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes stated in the court's opinion, the law cannot, I'm going to mess this up. The law cannot demand detached reflection in the face of an upraised knife.
Right.
So Guy's coming at you with a knife. You don't have time to go, what's the perfect reaction to this scenario?
Yeah.
So there's a wide
reasonable,
range
not
of
perfect.
reason. What's a wide range of reasonable? If all I got's a brick, I'm going to hit him with a brick. If I got a table leg, I'm going to hit him with a table leg. If I got a gun, which Mr. Brown had a gun, he shot dude, right? So
Right.
that was reasonable. We come into Graham, we come into Garner doctrine, and Garner versus Tennessee was a great ruling because the shooting, the killing of a young man by the police in Memphis, Tennessee, that led to the Graham versus Garner. That was Garner versus Tennessee decision. Was a young man, was a teenage kid who was fleeing a burglary that was merely a property crime. He got shot in the back and killed. That's unreasonable. That's completely unreasonable. The Supreme Court said it's unreasonable. So if you're going to shoot people fleeing, they gave you the guidelines of when you could or could not do that, when you should or should not do that. In the case of Mr. Brooks being shot, I believe that the officer is inside the ruling of Garner versus Tennessee and Graham v. Connor with Supreme Court guidance. Did a forcible person's felony just occur? It did.
Yes.
Was the officer assaulted? He was. Was the offender utilizing a weapon to facilitate his escape from a lawful arrest? Yes, he was.
Yes, he was.
All of that, anybody can look up Garner versus Tennessee and a Supreme Court guidance on that case. So if
I don't even think, Chuck, that it's not like, hey, this guy's fleeing. I think the officer draws his gun when he turns backwards and points the taser at him. So he turns around, points the taser at him, and that's when the officer goes, oh no, I got to change things. It's when the threat escalated to him that he said, nope, I got to get the gun here and go to work.
Mm-hmm. And I would agree with that. But if you read the guidance from Supreme Court, are they using a weapon to facilitate their escape? In this case,
Yes.
he clearly was doing so.
Yeah.
So that would be in play as part of Supreme Court doctrine. And anybody can look that up. But the officer, the officer took off running. His partner was still on the ground. What physical condition was he in? So as far as the officer is concerned, he's on his own. If he knows it's a taser or not, I think is immaterial. If he gets hit in the eye with a barb, is that great bodily harm? Yes, it is. If he gets hit in the throat with a barb, is that great bodily harm? It sure could be. If he gets hit with the taser and incapacitated, then could he be disarmed, kicked in the head, stomped on the throat while he's incapacitated from the taser shot? Yes, he could. If they missed a gun in the pat down, could he have pulled a gun? Could he have his partner's gun? None of this. The officer is unsure of any of this at that point.
Yeah, and he just sees the guy point this thing back towards him where he's just been bell rung. And Officer Rolfe, his statement that his lawyer put out said that he thought in that moment that it was probably a gun, that it wasn't a taser, that it was a gun. And that's why he drew his gun and shot. So if that's the statement that he gave to the police, in his debrief, there's no way they're going to get murder charges to stick on this one, I don't think. But now here's the next question. Oh, go ahead.
I agree. Which people are going to be very upset about. But if you look at the science of this, human reaction time, things like auditory exclusion, what did that taser pop sound like to the officer when it was pointed at him? Did he reasonably believe that a pistol had been produced during the course of this fight? He could reasonably believe that in the stress of the scenario.
I think most people don't think about that, Chuck. They don't think about in an auditory excluded state, under adrenaline, having just been punched in the face, I'm in a pursuit, I've just had this big thing, and now I'm fully amped up, adrenalized, that you can have a Mod Deuce 50 caliber machine gun and it's going to go pop, 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 pop. You're not going to hear this big one.
I'll point out, you can look at the firefight video that the FBI did after the 1986 Miami shootout.
Mm-hmm.
You can have, so it's not just auditory exclusion. I'm prone to what I call auditory tunnel vision. I get enough adrenaline on board. I can't hear things that I'm not looking at. I just happen to know I've been under stress enough to know that's how my body works.
Hmm.
If I'm looking at it, I can hear it. If I'm not looking at it, I can't hear it. I had an officer-involved shooting case where I fired 2 rounds from an M4 carbine, and I never heard my gun go off.
Wow.
I never heard my gun go off. The flip side is, if you look at that FBI video, the officers perceived their pistols as being very underpowered and popping when they shot.
Yeah.
And then Platt, the one bad guy with the Mini 14, when he shot at them, it sounded like a cannon. And that was very terrifying to them, how much louder that gun was. So they had a diminished sense of their own guns and an enhanced sense of the bad guy's rifle. So you have this distortion, not just exclusion sometimes.
Yeah.
Did that taser pop sound extra loud in the moment when he saw it? And he probably zoomed in visually on this, looked like a gun thing being pointed at him. That we know from Dr. Artwall's work in this, the psychology of this, that's completely plausible.
Yeah, very reasonable. So I want to get over to the other side of this a little bit. So the district attorney in this case decided to file charges very quickly. I mean, two things. Let's back up from there. Atlanta PD fired Officer Rolfe, 3 days after this happened. I didn't think that was possible, Chuck.
I'm going to guess that, and this is where people badmouth police unions a lot, but a lot of times you see in senior police leadership abuses of power. I have seen where we don't have a union in Kansas, but Fraternal Order of Police is a bargaining unit that we can do things like, hey, we'd like a pay raise. We're willing to trade this for that. So we do bargaining, collective bargaining. But I have seen the FOP have to step in because female officers were not being promoted. Officers were being forced to work and not given overtime, not given overtime pay. So they were ordered to work and not being paid for it. And if they didn't work, then they got disciplinary action. Well, if you're on the clock, you got to pay somebody for it. You can't fail to promote people just because they're female. So this whole police union thing getting a bad rap right now, that's BS right there. Just like other unions, like why did coal miner unions come into being? Because they really did make people work 24 hours a day,
Right.
20 hours a day in a coal mine and not pay them, and health conditions, all that. So unions have a place, but I'm going to guess that Atlanta PD violated some sort of bargaining unit due process clause, something like that. Atlanta is going to get sued for the firing. I guarantee you that they're going to be sued for a wrongful firing. Everybody is entitled to due process, both
Right.
in employment law and in the law. Why is our constitutional law written the way it was? Because if you go back to the Revolutionary War days, the king would arrest you and hold you in jail without charges, and sometimes forever. Why is there things like writs of habeas corpus and you can't do ex post facto laws? Because the founders knew this abuse of power was common and would occur. So that's why we have our constitutional law the way that it is.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't like our judicial system, but haven't compared it to,
Anything else.
other countries. There's a lot of places where the cops don't need a search warrant. They just search you. They just kick your door in. They just punch you in the face for looking at them wrong. You might really end up in the trunk with a bullet hole in your head. We don't do that here. That's not how things work. And thank God it's that way.
Well, okay. And likewise, so final one there, and that's what I said. I said, man, oh boy, that's going to be some big problems. Final one, district attorney filing charges without the Georgia Bureau of Investigation finishing their investigation.
I think this guy's political grandstanding. My understanding is he's not doing well in his reelection. My understanding is that he's also under investigation by the same Georgia Bureau of Investigation for improper receiving of hundreds of thousands of dollars that he can't explain. I could tell you, regardless of all of that, filing formal charges before you have a statement of probable cause from your investigators is highly irregular.
Yeah. I mean, has
As a
it ever
cop,
done? I mean, I suppose it could be, but boy, that seems really reckless.
it's really irregular. And I could tell you one of the things I've done as a cop is I've looked into cases and I'm like, hey, this guy's a suspect. I got probable cause. We do some investigation. Well, if I find out something different, I just proved dude innocent instead of proving dude guilty. So if I dig for that evidence and I find evidence that excludes him as a suspect, then that's where the investigation led.
Yeah,
I've
that's
looked at
good. Good. Okay.
yeah. And that's what a good investigator would do. And you have to look at things like I can tell you, I'll bet the autopsy was barely done. The toxicology is not done. The wound ballistics, the ballistic matching, did Officer X's gun fire bullet Y? None of that's been done. None of that's, breaking down of the video enhancement. I know you're familiar with what I'm talking about. There are people who are video forensics people who are going to go through this frame by frame. Maybe they have to enhance the audio or the video to figure something. None of that's been done. None of that has been done up to this point. So the investigation is incomplete. I don't think a district attorney should professionally jump to conclusions of charging, because if they can do it to this officer, they can do it to you.
I think that's a great point. I mean, again, if this is not an officer that this happens to, a private citizen, and we go, wait a minute, your investigators haven't even finished an investigation and you're already dropping charges. Now I've got to hire expensive attorneys and I'm getting punished with the process without even an investigation complete. Like that seems to me to be malicious almost.
It's definitely unprofessional, and it does not speak well to his competence and decision making. That's my opinion.
I also think it's kind of interesting. I looked and looked and looked. So some of the charges were that Officer Wolf kicked Mr. Brooks after he was down, that he hauled back and kicked him, and that Officer Bronson stood on his shoulder. Now, apparently in Officer Bronson's statement, he said he stood on his shoulder. And but the video of supposedly he released a still photo that seemed to show one of the officers, I couldn't really tell which one it was, kind of almost reared back with a foot. But why would you release a still photo when I have video of the entire incident? And so that seems really irregular again to me. So why wouldn't you release it if you have it? So given that you've released all this other video, that seems irregular to me.
If I was going to make a political point and charge the officer for what they did, and I was going to release the video of the shooting portion of it and then state these other things happened afterwards, why would I edit those things out? If they support, hey, I know I jumped the gun on the charges. I know Georgia Bureau of Investigation isn't done with their complaint yet. But I'll go back to the Mr. Floyd thing. If I were the chief of police of Minneapolis, the minute I saw the video of the officer on Floyd's neck, I don't need an autopsy. I don't need a cause of death. I don't need a coroner to confirm. Because quite frankly, if the coroner says that's not a homicide, legally it's not a homicide. If he says it is, it is. I don't even need that. The video in the Floyd case showed me as a police officer enough evidence for me to articulate and swear out a warrant for aggravated assault or aggravated battery. I'm sure one of those under Minneapolis or under Minnesota law would fit. And I would have arrested the officer that day and placed him into custody and then waited for the rest of the charges to be confirmed, autopsy, things like that. Sometimes you have enough of that on video. Let's say that was the case here in Atlanta. If I was the DA and I said, yeah, I know the GBI hasn't finished the case, but this is a video that shows why I am taking these extraordinary steps of charging these charges early. Why would I then edit the video and fail to show people what I'm claiming is there?
Right. That seems irregular.
It seems sketchy. It seems very sketchy.
Yeah. Time will tell, right? The investigation will be finished. Georgia Bureau of Investigation is good at this. This is not different than their investigation into the Ahmaud Arbery killing, which also happened in Georgia. And when GBI got in there, it got real and it got good. And I think that it seems to me that the Georgia Bureau of Investigation is doing a good and thorough job in these cases. And I have no doubt they'll do it again.
That I was very happy to see them get involved in the Arbery case, because I think a miscarriage of justice was in progress before they got involved. The charges, those guys being arrested is clearly substantiated. There was probable cause for those arrests and for the trial that will be upcoming. I was happy to see that go that way. I mirror your idea that I believe the GBI is doing a pretty solid chunk of police work here.
Yeah. Well, Chuck, man, you know how much I appreciate you, bro. And your perspective is so unique and so good. That's why we call you the legendary lawman. And so thank you so much for giving us some perspective from a law enforcement perspective. And man, as always, I really appreciate you.
It's my pleasure to be here and to get a forum to talk about this stuff, because I think a lot of what we have hitting the news, a lot of what we have is just bad PR, and people, I've lost track. When I was in a leadership position, I'd have an officer that made a complaint. Officer did this, officer did that. A lot of times people would tell me, I don't understand why they did that. Well, let's sit down and talk about why they did that. And then often people will go, oh, I didn't know that. They stopped your car because it matched a description of and was 2 numbers off on the tag of a bank robbery suspect from 2 days ago. So they had to see who was in the car, and then, whatever. When I explain it to them, so a lot of times it's the lack of understanding and the lack of communication. So it's nice to have an opportunity to be able to get real and talk about this stuff frankly. And I appreciate that.